A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes, by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 26. To that last nothing under earth. All eyes were turned to the entrance as Stephen spoke, and the ancient-mannered conclave scrutinized him inquiringly. 'Why, 'tis our Stephen,' said his father, rising from his seat, and still retaining the frothy mug in his left hand, he swung forward his right for a grasp. 'Your mother's expecting ye. Thought you would have come before dark, but you'll wait and go home with me. I have all but done for the day, and was going directly.' 'Yes, 'tis Master Stevie, sure enough. Glad to see you so soon again, Master Smith,' said Martin Cannister, chastening the gladness expressed in his words by a strict neutrality of countenance, in order to harmonize the feeling as much as possible with the solemnity of a family vault. 'The same to you, Martin, and you, William,' said Stephen, nodding around to the rest, who, having their mouths full of bread and cheese, were of necessity compelled to reply merely by compressing their eyes to friendly lines and wrinkles. 'And who is dead?' repeated Stephen. 'Lady Luxellian, poor gentlewoman, as we all shall,' said the under mason. 'Ay, and we be going to enlarge the vault to make room for her.' 'When did she die?' 'Early this morning,' his father replied, with an appearance of recurring to a chronic thought. 'Yes, this morning. Martin have been tolling ever since almost. There, 'twas expected. She was very limber.' 'Ay, poor soul, this morning,' resumed the under mason, a marvellously old man, whose skin seemed so much too large for his body that it would not stay in position. 'She must know by this time whether she's to go up or down, poor woman.' 'What was her age?' 'Not more than 7 or 8 and 20 by candlelight; but, Lord, by day 'a was 40 if it were an hour.' 'Ay, night time or daytime makes a difference of 20 years to rich females,' observed Martin. 'She was 31 really,' said John Smith. 'I had it from them that know.' 'Not more than that.' 'A looked very bad, poor lady. In faith, you might say she was dead for years afore she would own it. As my old father used to say, dead, but wouldn't drop down.' 'I seed her, poor soul,' said a labourer from behind some removed coffins, 'only but last Valentine's Day of all the world. I was arm and crook with my lord. I says to myself, "You be ticketed churchyard, my noble lady, though you don't dream on it." I suppose my lord will write to all them other lords anointed in the nation, and let 'em know that she that was is now no more. 'Tis done and past. I see a bundle of letters go off an hour after the death. Such wonderful black rims as they letters had, half an inch wide at the very least.' 'Too much,' observed Martin. 'In short, 'tis out of the question that a human being can be so mournful as black edges half an inch wide. I'm sure people don't feel more than a very narrow border when they feels most of all.' 'And there are 2 little girls, are there not?' said Stephen. 'Nice plain little faces left motherless now.' 'They used to come to Parson Swancourt's to play with Miss Elfride when I were there,' said William Worm. 'Ah, they did so's.' The latter sentence was introduced to add the necessary melancholy to a remark which intrinsically could hardly be made to possess enough for the occasion. 'Yes,' continued Worm, 'they'd run upstairs, they'd run down, flitting about with her everywhere. Very fond of her they were.' 'Ah, well.' 'Fonder than ever they were of her mother, so 'tis said here and there,' added a labourer. 'Well, you see, 'tis natural. Lady Luxellian stood aloof from 'em so, was so drowsy like, that they couldn't love her in the jolly companion way children want to like folks. Only last winter I seed Miss Elfride talking to my lady and the 2 children, and Miss Elfride wiped their noses for 'em so careful, my lady never once seeing that it wanted doing, and naturally children take to people that's their best friends. 'Be as 'twill, the woman is dead and gone, and we must make a place for her,' said John. 'Come, lads, drink up your ale, and we'll just rid this corner, so as to have all clear for beginning at the wall as soon as 'tis light to morrow.' Stephen then asked where Lady Luxellian was to lie. 'Here,' said his father. We're going to set back this wall and make a recess, and 'tis enough for us to do before the funeral. When my lord's mother died, she said, "John, the place must be enlarged before another can be put in, but I never expected 'twould be wanted so soon. Better move Lord George first, I suppose, Simeon." He pointed with his foot to a heavy coffin, covered with what had originally been red velvet, the colour of which could only just be distinguished now. "Just as ye think best, Master John," replied the shrivelled mason. "Ah, poor Lord George!" he continued, looking contemplatively at the huge coffin. "He and I were as bitter enemies once as any could be when one is a lord and t'other only a mortal man. Poor fellow! He'd clap his hand upon my shoulder, and cuss me as familiar and neighbourly as if he had been a common chap. Ay, 'a cuss me uphill and 'a cuss me down, and then 'a would rave out again, and the gold clamps of his fine new teeth would glisten in the sun like fetters of brass, while I, being a small man and poor, was fain to say nothing at all. Such a strapping fine gentleman as he was too. Yes, I rather liked en sometimes. But once, now and then, when I looked at his towering height, I thinked in my inside, what a weight you'll be, my lord, for our arms to lower under the aisle of Endelstow Church some day." "And was he?" inquired the young labourer. "He was. He was 500 weight if he were a pound, what with his lead and his oak and his handles and his one thing and t'other." Here the ancient man slapped his hand upon the cover with a force that caused a rattle among the bones inside. "He half broke my back when I took his feet to lower en down the steps there. Ah, saith I to John there, didn't I, John, that ever one man's glory should be such a weight upon another man. But there, I like my Lord George sometimes." "'Tis a strange thought," said another, "that while they be all here under one roof, a snug united family of Luxellians, they be really scattered miles away from one another in the form of good sheep and wicked goats, isn't it?" "True, it's a thought to look at." "And that one, if he's gone upward, don't know what his wife is doing no more than the man in the moon if she's gone downward. And that some unfortunate one in the hot place is a hollering across to a lucky one up in the clouds, and quite forgetting their bodies be boxed close together all the time. Ay, 'tis a thought to look at too, that I can say "Hullo" close to fiery Lord George, and 'a can't hear me. And that I be eating my onion close to dainty Lady Jane's nose, and she can't smell me." "What do 'em put all their heads one way for?" inquired the young man. "Because 'tis churchyard law, you simple. The law of the living is that a man should be upright and downright, and the law of the dead is that a man should be east and west. Every state of society have its laws." "We must break the law with a few of these poor souls, however. Come, buckle to it," said the master mason. And they set to work anew. The order of interment could be distinctly traced by observing the appearance of the coffins as they lay piled around. On those which had been standing there but a generation or two, the trappings still remained. Those of an earlier period showed bare wood, with a few tattered rags dangling therefrom. Earlier still, the wood lay in fragments on the floor of the niche, and the coffin consisted of naked lead alone, whilst in the case of the very oldest even the lead was bulging and cracking in pieces, revealing to the curious eye a heap of dust within. The shields upon many were quite loose and removable by the hand, their lustreless surface still indistinctly exhibiting the name and title of the deceased. Overhead, the groins and concavities of the arches curved in all directions, dropping low towards the walls, where the height was no more sufficient than to enable a person to stand upright. The body of George the 14th Baron, together with two or three others, all of more recent date than the great bulk of coffins piled there, had, for want of room, been placed at the end of the vault on trestles, and not in niches like the others. These it was necessary to remove, to form behind them the chamber in which they were ultimately to be deposited. Stephen, finding the place and proceedings in keeping with the sombre colours of his mind, waited there still. "Simeon, I suppose you can mind poor Lady Elfride, and how she ran away with the actor?" said John Smith after a while. "I think it fell upon the time my father was sexton here. Let us see, where is she?" "Here somewhere," returned Simeon, looking around him. "Why, I've got my arms round a very gentlewoman at this moment." He lowered the end of the coffin he was holding, wiped his face, and throwing a morsel of rotten wood upon another as an indicator, continued, 'That's her husband there. They was as fair a couple as you should see anywhere round about, and a good hearted pair likewise. Ay, I can mind it, though I was but a child at the time. She fell in love with this young man of hers, and their banns were asked in some church in London, and the old lord, her father, actually heard 'em asked 3 times, and didn't notice her name, being gabbled on with a host of others. And when she had married she told her father, and 'a fleed into a monstrous rage, and said she shouldn't have a farthing. Lady Elfride said she didn't think of wishing it. If he'd forgive her, 'twas all she asked, and as for a living, she was content to play plays with her husband. This frightened the old lord, and it give them a house to live in, and a great garden, and a little field or two, and a carriage, and a good few guineas. Well, the poor thing died at her first gossiping, and her husband, who was as tender hearted a man as ever eat meat, and would have died for her, went wild in his mind, and broke his heart, so 'twas said. Anyhow, they were buried the same day, mother and father, but the baby lived. Ay, my lord's family made much of that man then, and put him here with his wife. And there in the corner is the man now. The Sunday after there was a funeral sermon. The text was, "Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken." And when 'twas preaching, the men drew their hands across their eyes several times, and every woman cried out aloud. 'And what became of the baby?' said Stephen, who had frequently heard portions of the story. 'She was brought up by her grandmother, and a pretty maid she were. And she must needs run away with the curate, Parson Swancourt that is now. Then her grandmother died, and the title and everything went away to another branch of the family altogether. Parson Swancourt wasted a good deal of his wife's money, and she left him Miss Elfride. That trick of running away seems to be handed down in families like craziness or gout, and they two women be as alike as peas.' 'Which two?' 'Lady Elfride and young miss that's alive now. The same hair and eyes, but Miss Elfride's mother was darker a good deal.' 'Life's a strange bubble, you see,' said William Worm musingly. 'For if the Lord's anointment had descended upon women instead of men, Miss Elfride would be Lord Luxellian, Lady I mane. But as 'tis, the blood is run out, and she's nothing to the Luxellian family by law, whatever she may be by gospel.' 'I used to fancy,' said Simeon, 'when I seed Miss Elfride hugging the little ladyships, that there was a likeness. But I suppose 'twas only my dream, for years must have altered the family shape.' 'And now we'll move these two, and home along,' interposed John Smith, reviving, as became a master, the spirit of labour, which had showed unmistakable signs of being nearly vanquished by the spirit of chat. 'The flagon of ale we don't want we'll let bide here till to morrow. None of the poor souls will touch it, I believe.' So the evening's work was concluded, and the party drew from the abode of the quiet dead, closing the iron door, and shooting the lock loudly into the huge copper staple, an incongruous act of imprisonment towards those who had no dream of escape. End of chapter 26. Blue Eyes, chapter 27. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, chapter 27. How should I greet thee? Love frequently dies of time alone, much more frequently of displacement. With Elfride Swancourt, a powerful reason why the displacement should be successful was that the newcomer was a greater man than the first. By the side of the instructive and piquant snubbings she received from Knight, Stephen's general agreeableness seemed watery. By the side of Knight's spare love making, Stephen's continual outflow seemed lackadaisical. She had begun to sigh for somebody further on in manhood. Stephen was hardly enough of a man. Perhaps there was a proneness to inconstancy in her nature, a nature, to those who contemplate it from a standpoint beyond the influence of that inconstancy, the most exquisite of all in its plasticity and ready sympathies. Partly, too, Stephen's failure to make his hold on her heart a permanent one was his too timid habit of dispraising himself beside her. a peculiarity which, exercised towards sensible men, stirs a kindly chord of attachment that a marked assertiveness would leave untouched, but inevitably leads the most sensible woman in the world to undervalue him who practises it. Directly domineering ceases in a man, snubbing begins in the woman, the trite but no less unfortunate fact being that the gentler creature rarely has the capacity to appreciate fair treatment from her natural complement. The abiding perception of this position of Stephen's parents had, of course, a little to do with Elfride's renunciation. To such girls poverty may not be, as to the more worldly masses of humanity, a sin in itself, but it is a sin because graceful and dainty manners seldom exist in such an atmosphere. Few women of old family can be thoroughly taught that a fine soul may wear a smock frock, and an admittedly common man in one is but a worm in their eyes. John Smith's rough hands and clothes, his wife's dialect, the necessary narrowness of their ways being constantly under Elfride's notice, were not without their deflecting influence. On reaching home after the perilous adventure by the seashore, Knight had felt unwell, and retired almost immediately. The young lady who had materially assisted him had done the same, but she reappeared properly clothed about 5 o'clock. She wandered restlessly about the house, but not on account of their joint narrow escape from death. The storm which had torn the tree had merely bowed the reed, and with the deliverance of Knight all deep thought of the accident had left her. The mutual avowal which it had been the means of precipitating occupied a far longer length of her meditations. Elfride's disquiet now was on account of that miserable promise to meet Stephen, which returned like a spectre again and again. The perception of his littleness beside Knight grew upon her alarmingly. She now thought how sound had been her father's advice to her to give him up, and was passionately desirous of following it, as she had hitherto been averse. Perhaps there is nothing more hardening to the tone of young minds than thus to discover how their dearest and strongest wishes become gradually attuned by Time the cynic to the very note of some selfish policy which in earlier days they despised. The hour of appointment came, and with it a crisis, and with the crisis a collapse. 'God forgive me, I can't meet Stephen!' she exclaimed to herself. 'I don't love him less, but I love Mr. Knight more.' Yes, she would save herself from a man not fit for her, in spite of vows. She would obey her father, and have no more to do with Stephen Smith. Thus the fickle resolve showed signs of assuming the complexion of a virtue. The following days were passed without any definite avowal from Knight's lips. Such solitary walks and scenes as that witnessed by Smith in the summer house were frequent, but he courted her so intangibly that to any but such a delicate reception as Elfride's it would have appeared no courtship at all. The time now really began to be sweet with her. She dismissed the sense of sin in her past actions, and was automatic in the intoxication of the moment. The fact that Knight made no actual declaration was no drawback. Knowing since the betrayal of his sentiments that love for her really existed, she preferred it for the present in its form of essence, and was willing to avoid for a while the grosser medium of words. Their feelings having been forced to a rather premature demonstration, a reaction was indulged in by both. But no sooner had she got rid of her troubled conscience on the matter of faithlessness than a new anxiety confronted her. It was lest Knight should accidentally meet Stephen in the parish, and that herself should be the subject of discourse. Elfride, learning Knight more thoroughly, perceived that, far from having a notion of Stephen's precedence, he had no idea that she had ever been wooed before by anybody. On ordinary occasions she had a tongue so frank as to show her whole mind, and a mind so straightforward as to reveal her heart to its innermost shrine. But the time for a change had come. She never alluded to even a knowledge of Knight's friend. When women are secret, they are secret indeed, and more often than not they only begin to be secret with the advent of a second lover. The elopement was now a spectre worse than the first, and, like the spirit in Glenfinlas, it waxed taller with every attempt to lay it. Her natural honesty invited her to confide in Knight, and trust to his generosity for forgiveness. She knew also that as mere policy it would be better to tell him early, if he was to be told at all. The longer her concealment, the more difficult would be the revelation. But she put it off. The intense fear which accompanies intense love in young women was too strong to allow the exercise of a moral quality antagonistic to itself. Where love is great, the littlest doubts are fear. Where little fears grow great, great love grows there. The match was looked upon as made by her father and mother. The vicar remembered her promise to reveal the meaning of the telegram she had received, and 2 days after the scene in the summer house asked her pointedly. She was frank with him now. 'I have been corresponding with Stephen Smith ever since he left England till lately,' she calmly said.
'What!' cried the vicar, aghast. 'Under the eyes of Mr. Knight, too?'
'No. When I found I cared most for Mr. Knight, I obeyed you.'
'You are very kind, I am sure. When did you begin to like Mr. Knight?'
'I don't see that that is a pertinent question, papa. The telegram was from the shipping agent, and was not sent at my request. It announced the arrival of the vessel bringing him home.'
'Home? What, is he here?'
'Yes, in the village, I believe.'
'Has he tried to see you?'
'Only by fair means. But don't, papa, question me so. It is torture.'
'I will only say one more word,' he replied. 'Have you met him?'
'I have not. I can assure you that at the present moment there is no more of an understanding between me and the young man you so much disliked than between him and you. You told me to forget him, and I have forgotten him.'
'Oh, well, though you did not obey me in the beginning, you are a good girl, Elfride, in obeying me at last.'
'Oh, don't call me good, papa,' she said bitterly. 'You don't know, and the less said about some things the better. Remember, Mr. Knight knows nothing about the other. Oh, how wrong it all is! I don't know what I am coming to.'
'As matters stand, I should be inclined to tell him, or at any rate I should not alarm myself about his knowing. He found out the other day that this was the parish young Smith's father lives in. What put you in such a flurry?'
'I can't say. But promise, pray don't let him know. It would be my ruin.'
'Pooh, child! Knight is a good fellow and a clever man, but at the same time it does not escape my perceptions that he is no great catch for you. Men of his turn of mind are nothing so wonderful in the way of husbands. If you had chosen to wait you might have mated with a much wealthier man. But remember, I have not a word to say against your having him if you like him. Charlotte is delighted, as you know.
'Well, papa,' she said, smiling hopefully through a sigh, 'it is nice to feel that in giving way to caring for him I have pleased my family. But I am not good. Oh no, I am very far from that.'
'Oh, none of us are good, I am sorry to say,' said her father blandly. 'But girls have a chartered right to change their minds, you know. It has been recognized by poets from time immemorial. Catullus says, "Mulier cupido quod dicat amante, invento." What a memory mine is! However, the passage is that a woman's words to a lover are as a matter of course written only on wind and water. Now don't be troubled about that, Elfride.'
'Ah, you don't know.' They had been standing on the lawn, and Knight was now seen lingering some way down a winding walk. When Elfride met him it was with a much greater lightness of heart. Things were more straightforward now. The responsibility of her fickleness seemed partly shifted from her own shoulders to her father's. Still there were shadows. 'Ah, could he have known how far I went with Stephen, and yet have said the same, how much happier I should be!' That was her prevailing thought. In the afternoon the lovers went out together on horseback for an hour or two, and though not wishing to be observed, by reason of the late death of Lady Luxellian, whose funeral had taken place very privately on the previous day, they yet found it necessary to pass East Endelstow Church. The steps of the vault, as had been stated, were on the outside of the building, immediately under the aisle wall. Being on horseback, both Knight and Elfride could overlook the shrubs which screened the churchyard.
"Look, the vault seems still to be open," said Knight.
'Yes, it is open,' she answered.
"Who is that man close by it? The mason, I suppose."
'Yes.'
'I wonder if it's John Smith, Stephen's father?'
'I believe it is,' said Elfride with apprehension.
'Ah, and can it be? I should like to inquire how his son, my truant protege, is going on. And from your father's description of the vault, the interior must be interesting. Suppose we go in?'
'Had we better, do you think? May not Lord Luxellian be there?'
'It is not at all likely.'
Elfride then assented, since she could do nothing else. Her heart, which at first had quailed in consternation, recovered itself when she considered the character of John Smith. A quiet, unassuming man, he would be sure to act towards her as before those love passages with his son, which might have given a more pretentious mechanic airs. So, without much alarm, she took Knight's arm after dismounting, and went with him between and over the graves. The master mason recognized her as she approached, and as usual lifted his hat respectfully. 'I know you to be Mr. Smith, my former friend Stephen's father,' said Knight directly he had scanned the embrowned and ruddy features of John. 'Yes, sir, I believe I be.' 'How is your son now? I have only once heard from him since he went to India. I daresay you have heard him speak of me, Mr. Knight, who became acquainted with him some years ago in Exonbury.' 'Ay, I have that. Stephen's very well, thank you, sir. And he's in England. In fact, he's at home. In short, sir, he's down in the vault there, a looking at the departed coffins.' Elfride's heart fluttered like a butterfly. Knight looked amazed.
'Well, that is extraordinary,' he murmured. 'Did he know I was in the parish?' 'I really can't say, sir,' said John, wishing himself out of the entanglement he rather suspected than thoroughly understood. 'Would it be considered an intrusion by the family if we went into the vault?' 'Oh, bless ye, no, sir. Scores of folks have been stepping down. 'Tis left open o' purpose.' 'Will we go down, Elfride?'
'I am afraid the air is close,' she said appealingly.
'Oh no, ma'am,' said John. 'We white limed the walls and arches the day 'twas opened, as we always do, and again on the morning of the funeral. The place is as sweet as a granary.'
'Then I should like you to accompany me, Elfie, having originally sprung from the family too.' 'I don't like to go where death is so emphatically present. I'll stay by the horses whilst you go in. They may get loose.'
'What nonsense! I had no idea your sentiments were so flimsily formed as to be perturbed by a few remnants of mortality. But stay out, if you are so afraid, by all means.'
'Oh no, I am not afraid. Don't say that.' She held miserably to his arm, thinking that perhaps the revelation might as well come at once as 10 minutes later, for Stephen would be sure to accompany his friend to his horse. At first the gloom of the vault, which was lighted only by a couple of candles, was too great to admit of their seeing anything distinctly. But with a further advance Knight discerned, in front of the black masses lining the walls, a young man standing and writing in a pocket book. Knight said one word: 'Stephen.' Stephen Smith, not being in such absolute ignorance of Knight's whereabouts as Knight had been of Smith's, instantly recognized his friend, and knew by rote the outlines of the fair woman standing behind him. Stephen came forward and shook him by the hand without speaking.
'Why have you not written, my boy?'
said Knight, without in any way signifying Elfride's presence to Stephen. To the essayist, Smith was still the country lad whom he had patronized and tended, one to whom the formal presentation of a lady betrothed to himself would have seemed incongruous and absurd.
'Why haven't you written to me?' said Stephen.
'Ah, yes. Why haven't I? Why haven't we? That's always the query which we cannot entirely answer without an unsatisfactory sense of our inadequacies. However, I have not forgotten you, Smith, and now we have met we must meet again, and have a longer chat than this can conveniently be. I must know all you have been doing. That you have thriven I know, and you must teach me the way.' Elfride stood in the background. Stephen had read the position at a glance, and immediately guessed that she had never mentioned his name to Knight. His tact in avoiding catastrophes was the chief quality which made him intellectually respectable, in which quality he far transcended Knight; and he decided that a tranquil issue of the encounter, without any harrowing of the feelings of either Knight or Elfride, was to be attempted if possible. His old sense of indebtedness to Knight had never wholly forsaken him. His love for Elfride was generous now. As far as he dared look at her movements, he saw that her bearing towards him would be dictated by his own towards her, and if he acted as a stranger she would do likewise as a means of deliverance. Circumstances favouring this course, it was desirable also to be rather reserved towards Knight, to shorten the meeting as much as possible. 'I am afraid that my time is almost too short to allow even such a pleasure,' he said. 'I leave here to morrow, and until I start for the Continent and India, which will be in a fortnight, I shall have hardly a moment to spare.' Knight's disappointment and dissatisfied looks at this reply sent a pang through Stephen as great as any he had felt at the sight of Elfride. The words about shortness of time were literally true, but their tone was far from being so. He would have been gratified to talk with Knight as in past times, and saw as a dead loss to himself that to save the woman who cared nothing for him he was deliberately throwing away his friend. 'Oh, I am sorry to hear that,' said Knight in a changed tone. 'But of course if you have weighty concerns to attend to, they must not be neglected. And if this is to be our first and last meeting, let me say that I wish you success with all my heart.' Knight's warmth revived towards the end, the solemn impressions he was beginning to receive from the scene around him abstracting from his heart as a puerility any momentary vexation at words. 'It is a strange place for us to meet in,' he continued, looking around the vault. Stephen briefly assented, and there was silence. The blackened coffins were now revealed more clearly than at first, the whitened walls and arches throwing them forward in strong relief. It was a scene which was remembered by all three as an indelible mark in their history. Knight, with an abstracted face, was standing between his companions, though a little in advance of them, Elfride being on his right hand and Stephen Smith on his left. The white daylight on his right side gleamed faintly in, and was toned to a blueness by contrast with the yellow rays from the candle against the wall. Elfride, timidly shrinking back and nearest the entrance, received most of the light therefrom, while Stephen was entirely in candlelight, and to him the spot of outer sky visible above the steps was as a steely blue patch, and nothing more. 'I have been here 2 or 3 times since it was opened,' said Stephen. 'My father was engaged in the work, you know.' 'Yes. Well, what are you doing?' Knight inquired, looking at the notebook and pencil Stephen held in his hand. 'I have been sketching a few details in the church, and since then I have been copying the names of some of the coffins here. Before I left England I used to do a good deal of this sort of thing.' 'Yes, of course. Ah, that's poor Lady Luxellian, I suppose.' Knight pointed to a coffin of light satinwood, which stood on the stone sleepers in the new niche. 'And the remainder of the family are on this side. Who are those two, so snug and close together?' Stephen's voice altered slightly as he replied, 'That's Lady Elfride Kingsmore, born Luxellian, and that's Arthur, her husband. I have heard my father say that he ran away with her, and married her against the wishes of her parents.' 'Then I imagine that's where you got your Christian name, Miss Swancourt,' said Knight, turning to her. 'I think you told me it was 3 or 4 generations ago that your family branched off from the Luxellians.' 'She was my grandmother,' said Elfride, vainly endeavouring to moisten her dry lips before she spoke. Elfride had then the conscience stricken look of Guido's Magdalen, rendered upon a more childlike form. She kept her face partially away from Knight and Stephen, and set her eyes upon the sky visible outside, as if her salvation depended upon quickly reaching it. Her left hand rested lightly within Knight's arm, half withdrawn, from a sense of shame at claiming him before her old lover, yet unwilling to renounce him, so that her glove merely touched his sleeve. 'Can one be pardoned and retain the offence?' quoted Elfride's heart then. Conversation seemed to have no self sustaining power, and went on in the shape of disjointed remarks. 'One's mind gets thronged with thoughts while standing so solemnly here,' said Knight, in a measured, quiet voice. 'How much has been said on death from time to time! How much we ourselves can think upon it! We may fancy each of these who lie here saying, "For thou, to make my fall more great, didst lift me up on high." What comes next, Elfride? It is the 102nd Psalm I am thinking of.' 'Yes, I know it,' she murmured, and went on in a still lower voice, seemingly afraid for any words from the emotional side of her nature to reach Stephen. 'My days, just hastening to their end, are like an evening shade. My beauty doth, like withered grass, with waning lustre fade.' 'Well,' said Knight musingly, let us leave them. Such occasions as these seem to compel us to roam outside ourselves, far away from the fragile frame we live in,
and to expand till our perception grows so vast that our physical reality bears no sort of proportion to it.
We look back upon the weak and minute stem on which this luxuriant growth depends, and ask, can it be possible that such a capacity has a foundation so small? Must I again return to my daily walk in that narrow cell, a human body, where worldly thoughts can torture me? Do we not? 'Yes,' said Stephen and Elfride. One has a sense of wrong, too, that such an appreciative breath as a sentient being possesses should be committed to the frail casket of a body. What weakens one's intentions regarding the future like the thought of this? However, let us tune ourselves a more cheerful chord, for there's a great deal to be done yet by us all.' As Knight meditatively addressed his juniors thus,
Unconscious of the deception practised for different reasons,
by the severed hearts at his side, and of the scenes that had in their earlier days united them, each one felt that he and she did not gain by contrast with their musing mentor. Physically not so handsome as either the youthful architect or the vicar's daughter, the thoroughness and integrity of Knight illuminated his features with a dignity not even incipient in the other two. It is difficult to frame rules which shall apply to both sexes, and Elfride, an undeveloped girl, must, perhaps, hardly be laden with the moral responsibilities which attach to a man in like circumstances. The charm of woman, too, lies partly in her subtleness in matters of love. But if honesty is a virtue in itself, Elfride, having none of it now, seemed, being for being, scarcely good enough for Knight. Stephen, though deceptive for no unworthy purpose, was deceptive after all, and whatever good results grace such strategy if it succeeded, it seldom draws admiration, especially when it fails. On an ordinary occasion, had Knight been even quite alone with Stephen, he would hardly have alluded to his possible relationship to Elfride. But, moved by attendant circumstances, Knight was impelled to be confiding. 'Stephen,' he said, 'this lady is Miss Swancourt. I am staying at her father's house, as you probably know.' He stepped a few paces nearer to Smith, and said in a lower tone, 'I may as well tell you that we are engaged to be married.' Low as the words had been spoken, Elfride had heard them, and awaited Stephen's reply in a breathless silence, if that could be called silence where Elfride's dress, at each throb of her heart, shook and indicated it like a pulse glass, rustling also against the wall in reply to the same throbbing. The ray of daylight which reached her face lent it a blue pallor in comparison with those of the other two. 'I congratulate you,' Stephen whispered, and said aloud, 'I know Miss Swancourt a little. You must remember that my father is a parishioner of Mr. Swancourt's. I thought you possibly might not have lived at home since they have been here.' 'I have never lived at home, certainly, since that time.' 'I have seen Mr. Smith,' faltered Elfride. 'Well, there's no excuse for me. As strangers to each other I ought, I suppose, to have introduced you. As acquaintances I should not have stood so persistently between you. But the fact is, Smith, you seem a boy to me even now.' Stephen appeared to have a more than previous consciousness of the intense cruelty of his fate at the present moment. He could not repress the words, uttered with a dim bitterness. 'You should have said that I seemed still the rural mechanic's son I am, and hence an unfit subject for the ceremony of introductions.' 'Oh, no, 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 I won't have that!' Knight endeavoured to give his reply a laughing tone in Elfride's ears and an earnestness in Stephen's, in both which efforts he signally failed, and produced a forced speech pleasant to neither. 'Well, let us go to the open air again. Miss Swancourt, you are particularly silent. You mustn't mind Smith. I have known him for years, as I have told you.' 'Yes, you have,' she said. 'To think she has never mentioned her knowledge of me!' Smith murmured, and thought with some remorse how much her conduct resembled his own on his first arrival at her house as a stranger to the place. They ascended to the daylight, Knight taking no further notice of Elfride's manner, which, as usual, he attributed to the natural shyness of a young woman at being discovered walking with him on terms which left not much doubt of their meaning. Elfride stepped a little in advance, and passed through the churchyard. 'You are changed very considerably, Smith,' said Knight.
and I suppose it is no more than was to be expected. However, don't imagine that I shall feel any the less interest in you and your fortunes whenever you care to confide them to me. I have not forgotten the attachment you spoke of as your reason for going away to India. A London young lady, was it not? I hope all is prosperous.' 'No, the match is broken off.' It being always difficult to know whether to express sorrow or gladness under such circumstances, all depending upon the character of the match, Knight took shelter in the safe words. 'I trust it was for the best.' 'I hope it was. But I beg that you will not press me further. No, you have not pressed me, I don't mean that, but I would rather not speak upon the subject.' Stephen's words were hurried. Knight said no more, and they followed in the footsteps of Elfride, who still kept some paces in advance, and had not heard Knight's unconscious allusion to her. Stephen bade him adieu at the churchyard gate without going outside, and watched whilst he and his sweetheart mounted their horses. 'Good heavens, Elfride!' Knight exclaimed. 'How pale you are! I suppose I ought not have taken you into that vault. What is the matter?' 'Nothing,' said Elfride faintly. 'I shall be myself in a moment. All was so strange and unexpected down there that it made me unwell.' 'I thought you said very little. Shall I get you some water?' 'No, no.' 'Do you think it safe for you to mount?' 'Quite. Indeed it is,' she said with a look of appeal. 'Now then, up she goes,' whispered Knight, and lifted her tenderly into the saddle. Her old lover still looked on at the performance as he leant over the gate a dozen yards off. Once in the saddle, and having a firm grip of the reins, she turned her head as if by a resistless fascination, and for the first time since that memorable parting on the moor outside St. Launce's, after the passionate attempt at marriage with him, Elfride looked in the face of the young man she first had loved. He was the youth who had called her his inseparable wife many a time, and whom she had even addressed as her husband. Their eyes met. Measurement of life should be proportioned rather to the intensity of the experience than to its actual length. Their glance, but a moment chronologically, was a season in their history. To Elfride the intense agony of reproach in Stephen's eye was a nail piercing her heart with a deadliness no words can describe. With a spasmodic effort she withdrew her eyes, urged on the horse, and in the chaos of perturbed memories was oblivious of any presence beside her. The deed of deception was complete. Gaining a knoll on which the park transformed itself into a wood and copse, Knight came still closer to her side and said, 'Are you better now, dearest?' 'Oh yes.' She pressed a hand to her eyes as if to blot out the image of Stephen. A vivid scarlet spot now shone with preternatural brightness in the centre of each cheek, leaving the remainder of her face lily white as before. 'Elfride,' Knight said, rather in his old tone of mentor, 'you know I don't for a moment chide you, but is there not a great deal of unwomanly weakness in your allowing yourself to be so overwhelmed by the sight of what, after all, is no novelty? Every woman worthy of the name should, I think, be able to look upon death with something like composure. Surely you think so too?' 'Yes, I own it.' His obtuseness to the cause of her indisposition, by evidencing his entire freedom from the suspicion of anything behind the scenes, showed how incapable Knight was of deception himself, rather than any inherent dulness in him regarding human nature. This, clearly perceived by Elfride, added poignancy to her self reproach, and she idolized him the more because of their difference. Even the recent sight of Stephen's face and the sound of his voice, which for a moment had stirred a chord or two of ancient kindness, were unable to keep down the adoration re existent now that he was again out of view. She had replied to Knight's question hastily, and immediately went on to speak of indifferent subjects. After they had reached home she was apart from him till dinner time. When dinner was over, and they were watching the dusk in the drawing room, Knight stepped out upon the terrace. Elfride went after him very decisively, on the spur of a virtuous intention. 'Mr. Knight, I want to tell you something,' she said with quiet firmness. 'And what is it about?' gaily returned her lover. 'Happiness, I hope. Do not let anything keep you so sad as you seem to have been to day.' 'I cannot mention the matter until I tell you the whole substance of it,' she said, 'and that I will do to morrow.
I have been reminded of it to day. It is about something I once did, and I don't think I ought to have done.' This, it must be said, was rather a mild way of referring to a frantic passion and flight, which, much or little in itself, only accident had saved from being a scandal in the public eye. Knight thought the matter some trifle, and said pleasantly, 'Then I am not to hear the dreadful confession now?' 'No, not now. I did not mean to night,' Elfride responded, with a slight decline in the firmness of her voice. 'It is not light as you think it. It troubles me a great deal.' Fearing now the effect of her own earnestness, she added forcedly, 'Though perhaps you may think it light after all.' 'But you have not said when it is to be.' 'To morrow morning. Name a time, will you, and bind me to it. I want you to fix an hour, because I am weak, and may otherwise try to get out of it.' She added a little artificial laugh, which showed how timorous her resolution was still.
'Well, say after breakfast, at 11 o'clock.
'Yes, 11 o'clock, I promise you. Bind me strictly to my word.' End of chapter 27.
'28. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 28. I lull a fancy, trouble tossed.
'Miss Swancourt, it is 11 o'clock.
She was looking out of her dressing room window on the first floor, and Knight was regarding her from the terraced balustrade, upon which he had been idly sitting for some time, dividing the glances of his eye between the pages of a book in his hand, the brilliant hues of the geraniums and calceolarias, and the open window above mentioned. 'Yes, it is, I know. I am coming.' He drew closer and under the window.
'How are you this morning, Elfride? You look no better for your long night's rest.'
She appeared at the door shortly after, took his offered arm, and together they walked slowly down the gravel path leading to the river and away under the trees. Her resolution, sustained during the last 15 hours, had been to tell the whole truth, and now the moment had come. Step by step they advanced, and still she did not speak. They were nearly at the end of the walk when Knight broke the silence.
'Well, what is the confession, Elfride?'
She paused a moment, drew a long breath, and this is what she said. 'I told you one day, or rather I gave you to understand, what was not true. I fancy you taught me to mean I was 19 my next birthday, but it was my last I was 19. The moment had been too much for her. Now that the crisis had come, no qualms of conscience, no love of honesty, no yearning to make a confidence and obtain forgiveness with a kiss, could string Elfride up to the venture. Her dread lest he should be unforgiving was heightened by the thought of yesterday's artifice, which might possibly add disgust to his disappointment. The certainty of one more day's affection, which she gained by silence, outvalued the hope of perpetuity combined with the risk of all. The trepidation caused by these thoughts on what she had intended to say shook so naturally the words she did say that Knight never for a moment suspected them to be a last moment substitution. He smiled and pressed her hand warmly.
'My dear Elfie, yes, you are now no protestation. What a winning little woman you are, to be so absurdly scrupulous about a mere iota. Really, I never once have thought whether your 19th year was the last or the present. And by George, well I may not, for it would never do for a staid fogey a dozen years older to stand upon such a trifle as that.'
'Don't praise me, don't praise me. Though I prize it from your lips, I don't deserve it now.'
But Knight, being in an exceptionally genial mood, merely saw this distressful exclamation as modesty. 'Well,' he added after a minute, 'I like you all the better, you know, for such moral precision, although I called it absurd.' He went on with tender earnestness. 'For, Elfride, there is one thing I do love to see in a woman,
That is, a soul truthful and clear as heaven's light. I could put up with anything if I had that. Forgive nothing if I had it not. Elfride, you have such a soul, if ever a woman had, and having it, retain it, and don't ever listen to the fashionable theories of the day about a woman's privileges and natural right to practise wiles. Depend upon it, my dear girl, that a noble woman must be as honest as a noble man. I specially mean by honesty fairness, not only in matters of business and social detail, but in all the delicate dealings of love, to which the licence given to your sex particularly refers.' Elfride looked troublously at the trees. 'Now let us go on to the river, Elfie.' 'I would if I had a hat on,' she said with a sort of suppressed woe. 'I will get it for you,' said Knight, very willing to purchase her companionship at so cheap a price. 'You sit down there a minute.' And he turned and walked rapidly back to the house for the article in question. Elfride sat down upon one of the rustic benches which adorned this portion of the grounds, and remained with her eyes upon the grass. She was induced to lift them by hearing the brush of light and irregular footsteps hard by. Passing along the path which intersected the one she was in, and traversed the outer shrubberies, Elfride beheld the farmer's widow, Mrs. Jethway. Before she noticed Elfride, she paused to look at the house, portions of which were visible through the bushes. Elfride, shrinking back, hoped the unpleasant woman might go on without seeing her. But Mrs. Jethway, silently apostrophizing the house, with actions which seemed dictated by a half overturned reason, had discerned the girl, and immediately came up and stood in front of her. 'Ah, Miss Swancourt, why did you disturb me? Mustn't I trespass here?' 'You may walk here if you like, Mrs. Jethway. I do not disturb you.' 'You disturb my mind, and my mind is my whole life, for my boy is there still, and he is gone from my body.' 'Yes, poor young man. I was sorry when he died.' 'You know what he died of?' 'Consumption.' 'Oh no, no,' said the widow. 'That word consumption covers a deal. He died because you were his own well agreed sweetheart, and then proved false, and it killed him. Yes, Miss Swancourt,' she said in an excited whisper, 'you killed my son.' 'How can you be so wicked and foolish?' replied Elfride, rising indignantly. But indignation was not natural to her, and having been so worn and harrowed by late events, she lost any power of defence that mood might have lent her. 'I could not help his loving me, Mrs. Jethway.' 'That's just what you could have helped. You know how it began, Miss Elfride. Yes, you said you liked the name of Felix better than any other name in the parish, and you knew it was his name, and that those you said it to would report it to him.' 'I knew it was his name, of course I did. But I am sure, Mrs. Jethway, I did not intend anybody to tell him.' 'But you knew they would.' 'No, I didn't.' 'And then, after that, when you were riding on Revels Day by our house, and the lads were gathered there, and you wanted to dismount, when Jim Drake and George Upway and 3 or 4 more ran to hold your pony, and Felix stood back timid, why did you beckon to him and say you would rather he held it?' 'Oh, Miss Jethway, you think so mistakenly. I liked him best, that's why I wanted him to do it. He was gentle and nice. I always thought him so, and liked him.' 'Then why did you let him kiss you?' 'It is a falsehood! Oh, it is!' said Elfride, weeping with desperation. 'He came behind me and attempted to kiss me, and that was why I told him I never wanted to see him again.' 'But you did not tell your father or anybody, as you would have if you had looked upon it then as the insult you now pretend it was?' 'He begged me not to tell, and foolishly enough I did not. And I wish I had now. I little expected to be scourged with my own kindness. Pray leave me, Mrs. Jethway.' The girl only expostulated now. 'Well, you harshly dismissed him, and he died. And before his body was cold you took another to your heart. Then as carelessly sent him about his business, and took a third. And if you consider that nothing, Miss Swancourt,' she continued, drawing closer, 'it led on to what was very serious indeed. Have you forgotten that would be runaway marriage, the journey to London, and the return the next day without being married? And that there's enough disgrace in that to ruin a woman's good name far less light than yours. You may have. I have not. Fickleness towards a lover is bad, but fickleness after playing the wife is wantonness.' 'Oh, it is a wicked, cruel lie! Do not say it, oh, do not!' 'Does your new man know of it? I think not, or he would be no man of yours. As much of the story as was known is creeping about the neighbourhood even now, but I know more of it than any of them. And why should I respect your love?' 'I defy you!' cried Elfride tempestuously. 'Do and say all you can to ruin me. Try! Put your tongue at work. I invite it. I defy you as a slanderous woman. Look, there he comes!' And her voice trembled greatly as she saw through the leaves the beloved form of Knight coming from the door with her hat in his hand. 'Tell him at once. I can bear it.' 'Not now,' said the woman, and disappeared down the path. The excitement of her latter words had restored colour to Elfride's cheeks, and hastily wiping her eyes she walked further on, so that by the time her lover had overtaken her the traces of emotion had nearly disappeared from her face. Knight put the hat on her head, took her hand, and drew it within his arm. It was the last day but one previous to their departure for St. Leonards, and Knight seemed to have a purpose in being much in her company that day. They rambled along the valley. The season was that period in the autumn when the foliage alone of an ordinary plantation is rich enough in hues to exhaust the chromatic combinations of an artist's palette. Most lustrous of all are the beeches, graduating from bright rusty red at the extremity of the boughs to a bright yellow at their inner parts. Young oaks are still of a neutral green. Scotch firs and hollies are nearly blue, whilst occasional dottings of other varieties give maroons and purples of every tinge. The river, such as it was, here pursued its course amid flagstones as level as a pavement, but divided by crevices of irregular width. With the summer drought the torrent had narrowed till it was now but a thread of crystal clearness, meandering along a central channel in the rocky bed of the winter current. Knight scrambled through the bushes, which at this point nearly covered the brook from sight, and leapt down upon the dry portion of the river bottom. 'Elfride, I never saw such a sight!' he exclaimed. 'The hazels overhang the river's course in a perfect arch, and the floor is beautifully paved. The place reminds one of the passages of a cloister. Let me help you down.' He assisted her through the marginal underwood and down to the stones. They walked on together to a tiny cascade about a foot wide and high, and sat down beside it on the flags that for 9 months of the year were submerged beneath a gushing bourne. From their feet trickled the attenuated thread of water which alone remained to tell the intent and reason of this leaf covered isle, and journeyed on in a zigzag line till lost in the shade. Knight, leaning on his elbow, after contemplating all this, looked critically at Elfride. 'Does not such a luxuriant head of hair exhaust itself and get thin as the years go on from 18 to 28?' he asked at length. 'Oh no,' she said quickly, with a visible disinclination to harbour such a thought, which came upon her with an unpleasantness whose force it would be difficult for men to understand. She added afterwards with smouldering uneasiness, 'Do you really think that a great abundance of hair is more likely to get thin than a moderate quantity?' 'Yes, I really do. I am almost sure in fact, that if statistics could be obtained on the subject, you would find the persons with thin hair were those who had a superabundance originally, and that those who start with a moderate quantity retain it without much loss.' Elfride's troubles sat upon her face as well as in her heart. Perhaps to a woman it is almost as dreadful to think of losing her beauty as of losing her reputation. At any rate, she looked quite as gloomy as she had looked at any minute that day. 'You shouldn't be so troubled about a mere personal adornment,' said Knight, with some of the severity of tone that had been customary before she had beguiled him into softness. 'I think it is a woman's duty to be as beautiful as she can. If I were a scholar, I would give you chapter and verse of it from one of your own Latin authors. I know there is such a passage, for papa has alluded to it.' 'Munditiae et aretes et cultus, and etc. Is that it? A passage in Livy, which is no defence at all.' 'No, it is not that.'
'Never mind then, for I have a reason for not taking up my old cudgels against you, Elfie. Can you guess what the reason is?
'No, but I am glad to hear it,' she said thankfully, 'for it is dreadful when you talk so. For whatever dreadful name the weakness may deserve, I must candidly own that I am terrified to think that my hair may ever get thin.'
'Of course, a sensible woman would rather lose her wits than her beauty.'
'I don't care if you do say satire and judge me cruelly. I know my hair is beautiful; everybody says so.'
'Why, my dear Miss Swancourt,' he tenderly replied, 'I have not said anything against it. But you know what is said about handsome being and handsome doing.'
'Poor Miss Handsome Does cuts but a sorry figure beside Miss Handsome Is, in every man's eyes, your own not excepted, Mr. Knight, though it pleases you to throw off so,' said Elfride saucily, and lowering her voice. 'You ought not to have taken so much trouble to save me from falling over the cliff, for you don't think mine a life worth much trouble, evidently.'
'Perhaps you think mine was not worth yours.'
'It was worth anybody's.' Her hand was plashing in the little waterfall, and her eyes were bent the same way.
'You talk about my severity with you, Elfride. You are unkind to me, you know.'
'How?' she asked, looking up from her idle occupation.
'After taking my trouble to get jewellery to please you, you wouldn't accept it.'
'Perhaps I would now. Perhaps I want to.'
'Do,'
said Knight. And the packet was withdrawn from his pocket and presented the third time. Elfride took it with delight. The obstacle was rent in twain, and the significant gift was hers. 'I'll take out these ugly ones at once,' she exclaimed, 'and I'll wear yours, shall I?'
'I should be gratified.'
Now, though it may seem unlikely, considering how far the two had gone in converse, Knight had never yet ventured to kiss Elfride. Far slower was he than Stephen Smith in matters like that. The utmost advance he had made in such demonstrations had been the degree witnessed by Stephen in the summer house. So, Elfride's cheek being still forbidden fruit to him, he said impulsively, 'Elfie, I should like to touch that seductive ear of yours. Those are my gifts, so let me dress you in them.' She hesitated with a stimulating hesitation. 'Let me put just one in its place, then.' Her face grew much warmer. 'I don't think it would be quite the usual or proper course,' she said, suddenly turning and resuming her operation of plashing in the miniature cataract. The stillness of things was disturbed by a bird coming to the streamlet to drink. After watching him dip his bill, sprinkle himself, and fly into a tree, Knight replied, with the courteous brusqueness she so much liked to hear,
'Elfride, now you may as well be fair. You would mind my doing it but little, I think, so give me leave, do.'
'I will be fair, then,' she said confidingly, and looking him full in the face. It was a particular pleasure to her to be able to do a little honesty without fear. 'I should not mind your doing so. I should like such attention. My thought was, would it be right to let you?'
'Then I will,'
he rejoined, with that singular earnestness about a small matter, in the eyes of a ladies' man but a momentary peg for flirtation or jest, which is only found in deep natures who have been wholly unused to toying with womankind, and which, from its unwontedness, is in itself a tribute of the most precious that can be rendered, and homage the most exquisite to be received. 'And you shall,' she whispered without reserve, and no longer mistress of the ceremonies. Then Elfride inclined herself towards him, thrust back her hair, and poised her head sideways. In doing this, her arm and shoulder necessarily rested against his breast. At the touch, the sensation of both seemed to be concentrated at the point of contact. All the time he was performing the delicate manoeuvre, Knight trembled like a young surgeon in his first operation. 'Now the other one,' said Knight in a whisper. 'No, no.' 'Why not?' 'I don't know exactly.'
'You must know.'
'Your touch agitates me so. Let us go home.'
'Don't say that, Elfride. What is it, after all? A mere nothing. Now turn around, dearest.'
She was powerless to disobey, and turned forthwith. And then, without any defined intention in either's mind, his face and hers drew closer together, and he supported her there and kissed her. Knight was at once the most ardent and the coolest man alive. When his emotions slumbered, he appeared almost phlegmatic. When they were moved, he was no less than passionate. And now, without having quite intended an early marriage, he put the question plainly. It came with all the ardour which was the accumulation of long years behind a natural reserve. 'Elfride, when shall we be married?' The words were sweet to her, but there was a bitter in the sweet. These newly overt acts of his, which had culminated in this plain question, coming on the very day of Mrs. Jethway's blasting reproaches, painted distinctly her fickleness as an enormity. Loving him in secret had not seemed such thoroughgoing inconstancy as the same love recognized and acted upon in the face of threats. Her distraction was interpreted by him at her side as the outward signs of an unwonted experience. 'I don't press you for an answer now, darling,' he said, seeing she was not likely to give a lucid reply. 'Take your time.' Knight was as honourable a man as was ever loved and deluded by a woman. It may be said that his blindness in love proved a point, for shrewdness in love usually goes with meanness in general. Once the passion had mastered him, the intellect had gone for naught. Knight, as a lover, was more single minded and far simpler than his friend Stephen, who in other capacities was shallow beside him. Without saying more on the subject of their marriage, Knight held her at arm's length as if she had been a large bouquet, and looked at her with critical affection. 'Does your pretty gift become me?' she inquired, with tears of excitement on the fringes of her eyes. 'Undoubtedly, perfectly,' said her lover, adopting a lighter tone to put her at her ease. 'Ah, you should see them! You look shinier than ever. Fancy that I have been able to improve you!' 'Am I really so nice? I am glad for your sake. I wish I could see myself.' 'You can't. You must wait till we get home.' 'I shall never be able,' she said, laughing. 'Look, here's a way.' 'So there is. Well done, woman's wit.' 'Hold me steady.' 'Oh yes.' 'And don't let me fall, will you?' 'By no means.' Below their seat the thread of water paused to spread out into a smooth small pool. Knight supported her while she knelt down and leant over it. 'I can see myself. Really, try as religiously as I will, I cannot help admiring my appearance in them.' 'Doubtless. How can you be so fond of finery? I believe you are corrupting me into a taste for it. I used to hate every such thing before I knew you.' 'I like ornaments because I want people to admire what you possess, and envy you, and say, "I wish I was he."
'I suppose I ought not object after that. And how much longer are you going to look at yourself there?'
'Until you are tired of holding me. Oh, I want to ask you something.' And she turned round. 'Now tell truly, won't you? What colour of hair do you like best now?' Knight did not answer at the moment. 'Say light, do,' she whispered coaxingly. 'Don't say dark, as you did that time.'
'Light brown, then. Exactly the colour of my sweethearts.'
'Really?' said Elfride, enjoying as truth what she knew to be flattery.
'Yes.'
'And blue eyes too, not hazel? Say yes, say yes.'
'One recantation is enough for to day.'
'No, no.'
'Very well, blue eyes.'
And Knight laughed and drew her close and kissed her a second time, which operations he performed with the carefulness of a fruiterer touching a bunch of grapes so as not to disturb their bloom. Elfride objected to a second, and flung her face away, the movement causing a slight disarrangement of hat and hair. Hardly thinking what she said in the trepidation of the moment, she exclaimed, clapping her hand to her ear, 'Ah, we must be careful! I lost the other earring doing like this.' No sooner did she realize the significant words than a troubled look passed across her face, and she shut her lips as if to keep them back.
'Doing like what?'
said Knight, perplexed. 'Oh, sitting down out of doors,' she replied hastily. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
audiobook.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 29. Care, thou canker. It is an evening at the beginning of October, and the mellowest of autumn sunsets irradiates London even to its uttermost eastern end. Between the eye and the flaming west, columns of smoke stand up in the still air like tall trees. Everything in the shade is rich and misty blue. Mr. and Mrs. Swancourt and Elfride are looking at these lustrous, lurid contrasts from the window of a large hotel near London Bridge. The visit to their friends at St. Leonard's is over, and they are staying a day or two in the metropolis on their way home. Knight spent the same interval of time in crossing over to Brittany by the way of Jersey and St. Malo. He then passed through Normandy and returned to London also, his arrival there having been 2 days later than that of Elfride and her parents. So the evening of this October day saw them all meeting in the above mentioned hotel, where they had previously engaged apartments. During the afternoon Knight had been to his lodgings at Richmond to make a little change in the nature of his baggage, and on coming up again there was never ushered by a bland waiter into a comfortable room a happier man than Knight, when shown to where Elfride and her stepmother were sitting after a fatiguing day of shopping. Elfride looked none the better for her change. Knight was as brown as a nut. They were soon engaged by themselves in the corner of the room. Now that the precious words of promise had been spoken, the young girl had no idea of keeping up her price by the system of reserve which other more accomplished maidens use. Her lover was with her again, and it was enough. She made her heart over to him entirely. Dinner was soon dispatched, and when a preliminary round of conversation concerning their doings since the last parting had been concluded, they reverted to the subject of tomorrow's journey home. 'That enervating ride through the myrtle climate of South Devon, how I dread it to morrow!' Mrs. Swancourt was saying. 'I had hoped the weather would have been cooler by this time.' 'Did you ever go by water?' said Knight. 'Never. By never I mean not since the time of railways.' 'Then if you can afford an additional day, I propose that we do it,' said Knight. 'The channel is like a lake just now. We should reach Plymouth in about 40 hours, I think, and the boat starts from just below the bridge here,' pointing over his shoulder eastward. 'Hear, hear!' said the vicar. 'It is an idea, certainly,' said his wife. 'Of course these coasters are rather tubby,' said Knight, 'but you wouldn't mind that?' 'No, we wouldn't mind.' 'And the saloon is a place like the fish market of a ninth-rate country town, but that wouldn't matter.' 'Oh dear, no. If we had only thought of it soon enough, we might have had the use of Lord Luxellian's yacht. But never mind, we'll go. We shall escape the worrying rattle through the whole length of London to morrow morning, not to mention the risk of being killed by excursion trains, which is not a little one at this time of the year, if the papers are true.' Elfride, too, thought the arrangement delightful, and accordingly 10 o'clock the following morning saw 2 cabs crawling around by the Mint, and between the preternaturally high walls of Nightingale Lane towards the riverside. The first vehicle was occupied by the travellers in person, and the second brought up the luggage, under the supervision of Mrs. Snewson, Mrs. Swancourt's maid, and for the last fortnight Elfride's also. For although the younger lady had never been accustomed to any such attendant at roving times, her stepmother forced her into a semblance of familiarity with one when they were away from home. Presently waggons, bales, and smells of all descriptions increased to such an extent that the advance of the cabs was at the slowest possible rate. At intervals it was necessary to halt entirely, that the heavy vehicles unloading in front might be moved aside, a feat which was not accomplished without a great deal of swearing and noise. The vicar put his head out of the window. 'Surely there must be some mistake in the way,' he said with great concern, drawing his head in again. 'There is not a respectable conveyance to be seen here except ours. I have heard that there are strange dens in this part of London into which people have been entrapped and murdered. Surely there is no conspiracy on the part of the cabman?' 'Oh no, no, it's all right,' said Mr. Knight, who was as placid as dewy Eve by the side of Elfride.
But what I argue from,' said the vicar, with a greater emphasis on uneasiness, 'are plain appearances. This can't be the highway from London to Plymouth by water, because it is no way at all to any place. We shall miss our steamer and our train too, that's what I think.' 'Depend upon it we are right. In fact, here we are.' 'Trimmer's Wharf,' said the cabman, opening the door.
No sooner had they alighted than they perceived a tussle going on between the hindmost cabman and a crowd of light porters, who had charged them in column to obtain possession of the bags and boxes, Mrs. Snewson's hands being seen stretched towards heaven in the midst of the melee. Knight advanced gallantly, and after a hard struggle reduced the crowd to two, upon whose shoulders and trucks the goods vanished away in the direction of the water's edge with startling rapidity. Then more of the tribe who had run on ahead were heard shouting to boatmen, three of whom pulled alongside, and, two being vanquished, the luggage went tumbling into the remaining one.
'Never saw such a dreadful scene in my life, never,' said Mr. Swancourt, floundering into the boat. 'Worse than famine and sword upon one. I thought such customs were confined to continental ports. Aren't you astonished, Elfride?'
'Oh no,' said Elfride, appearing amid the dingy scene like a rainbow in a murky sky. 'It is a pleasant novelty, I think.'
'Where in the wild ocean is our steamer?' the vicar inquired. 'I can see nothing but old hulks for the life of me.'
'Just behind that one,' said Knight. 'We shall soon be around under her.' The object of their search was soon after disclosed to view, a great lumbering form of inky blackness, which looked as if it had never known the touch of a paintbrush for 50 years. It was lying beside just such another, and the way on board was down a narrow lane of water between the two, about a yard and a half wide at one end, and gradually converging to a point. At the moment of their entry into this narrow passage, a brilliantly painted rival paddled down the river like a trotting steed, creating such a series of waves and splashes that their frail wherry was tossed like a teacup, and the vicar and his wife slanted this way and that, inclining their heads into contact with a Punch and Judy air and countenance, the wavelets striking the sides of the two hulls and flapping back into their laps.
'Dreadful! Ah, horrible!' Mr. Swancourt murmured privately, and said aloud, 'I thought we walked on board. I don't think really I should have come, if I had known this trouble was attached to it.'
'If they must splash, I wish they would splash us with clean water,' said the old lady, wiping her dress with her handkerchief.
'I hope it is perfectly safe,' continued the vicar.
'Oh, papa, you are not very brave!' cried Elfride merrily.
'Bravery is only obtuseness to the perception of contingencies,' Mr. Swancourt severely answered.
Mrs. Swancourt laughed, and Elfride laughed, and Knight laughed, in the midst of which pleasantness a man shouted to them from some position between their heads and the sky, and they found that they were close to the Juliet, into which they quiveringly ascended. It having been found that the lowness of the tide would prevent their getting off for an hour, the Swancourts, having nothing else to do, allowed their eyes to idle upon men in blue jerseys performing mysterious mending operations with tar twine. They turned to look at the dashes of lurid sunlight, like burnished copper stars afloat on the ripples, which danced into and tantalized their vision, or listened to the loud music of a steam crane at work close by, or to sighing sounds from the funnels of passing steamers getting dead as they grew more distant, or to shouts from the decks of different craft in their vicinity, all of them assuming the form of 'Ah, hey!' 10:30, not yet off. Mr. Swancourt breathed a breath of weariness, and looked at his fellow travellers in general. Their faces were certainly not worth looking at. The expression 'waiting' was written upon them so absolutely that nothing more could be discerned there. All animation was suspended till Providence should raise the water and let them go. 'I have been thinking,' said Knight, 'that we have come amongst the rarest class of people in the kingdom. Of all human characteristics, a low opinion of the value of his own time by an individual must be among the strangest to find. Here we see numbers of that patient and happy species, rovers as distinct from travellers.' 'But they are pleasure seekers to whom time is of no importance.'
'Oh no. The pleasure seekers we meet on the grand routes are more anxious than commercial travellers to rush on.
And added to the loss of time in getting to their journey's end, these exceptional people take their chances of sea sickness by coming this way.' 'Can it be?' inquired the vicar with apprehension. 'Surely not, Mr. Knight, just here in our English Channel, close at our doors, as I may say. Entrance passages are very draughty places, and the Channel is like the rest. It ruins the temper of sailors. It has been calculated by philosophers that more damns go up to heaven from the Channel in the course of a year than from all the five oceans put together.' They really start now, and the dead looks of all the throng come to life immediately. The man who had been frantically hauling the rope that bade fair to have no end ceases his labours, and they glide down the serpentine bends of the Thames. Anything anywhere was a mine of interest to Elfride, and so was this. 'It is well enough now,' said Mrs. Swancourt after they passed the Nore, 'but I can't say I have cared for my voyage hitherto.' For being now in the open sea, a slight breeze had sprung up, which cheered her as well as her two younger companions. But unfortunately it had a reverse effect upon the vicar, who, after turning a sort of apricot jam colour, interspersed with dashes of raspberry, pleaded indisposition, and vanished from their sight. The afternoon wore on. Mrs. Swancourt kindly sat apart by herself reading, and the betrothed pair were left to themselves. Elfride clung trustingly to Knight's arm, and proud was she to walk with him up and down the deck, or to go forward and, leaning with him against the forecastle rails, watch the settling sun gradually withdrawing itself over the stern into a huge bank of livid cloud, with golden edges that rose to meet it. She was childishly full of life and spirits, though in walking up and down with him before the other passengers, and getting noticed by them, she was at starting rather confused, it being the first time she had shown herself so openly under that kind of protection. 'I expect they are envious, and saying things about us, don't you?' she would whisper to Knight with a stealthy smile. 'Oh no,' he would answer unconcernedly. 'Why should they envy us, and what can they say?' 'Not any harm, of course,' Elfride replied, 'except such as this. How happy those two are! She is proud enough now. What makes it worse,' she continued with the extremity of confidence, 'I heard those two cricketing men say just now, "She's the nobbiest girl on the boat." But I don't mind it, you know, Harry.' 'I should hardly have supposed you did, even if you had not told me,' said Knight with great blandness. She was never tired of asking her lover questions and admiring his answers, good, bad, or indifferent as they might be. The evening grew dark and night came on, and lights shone upon them from the horizon and from the sky. 'Now look ahead of us at that halo in the air of silvery brightness. Watch it, and you will see what it comes to.' She watched for a few minutes, when two white lights emerged from the side of a hill, and showed themselves to be the origin of the halo. 'What a dazzling brilliance! What do they mark?' 'The South Foreland. They were previously covered by the cliff.' 'What is that level line of little sparkles? A town, I suppose?' 'That's Dover.' All this time and later, soft sheet lightning expanded from a cloud in their path, enkindling their faces as they paced up and down, shining over the water, and for a moment showing the horizon as a keen line. Elfride slept soundly that night. Her first thought the next morning was a thrilling one, that Knight was as close at hand as when they were at home in Endelstow; and her first sight, on looking out of the cabin window, was the perpendicular face of Beachy Head, gleaming white in a brilliant 6 o'clock in the morning sun. This fair daybreak, however, soon changed its aspect. A cold wind and a pale mist descended upon the sea, and seemed to threaten a dreary day. When they were nearing Southampton, Mrs. Swancourt came to say that her husband was so ill that he wished to be put on shore here, and left to do the remainder of the journey by land. He will be perfectly well directly he treads firm ground again. Which shall we do, go with him, or finish our voyage as we intended?' Elfride was comfortably housed under an umbrella which Knight was holding over her to keep off the wind. 'Oh, don't let us go on shore!' she said with dismay. 'It would be such a pity.' 'That's very fine,' said Mrs. Swancourt archly, as to a child. 'See, the wind has increased her colour, the sea her appetite and spirits, and somebody her happiness. Yes, it would be a pity, certainly. 'Tis my misfortune to be always spoken to from a pedestal,' sighed Elfride.
'Well, we will do as you like, Mrs. Swancourt,' said Knight. 'But
I myself would rather remain on board,' interrupted the elder lady, 'and Mr. Swancourt particularly wishes to go by himself, so that shall settle the matter.' The vicar, now a drab colour, was put ashore, and became as well as ever forthwith. Elfride, sitting alone in a retired part of the vessel, saw a veiled woman walk aboard among the very latest arrivals at this port. She was clothed in black silk, and carried a dark shawl upon her arm. The woman, without looking round, turned to the quarter allotted to the second cabin passengers. All the carnation Mrs. Swancourt had complimented her stepdaughter upon possessing left Elfride's cheeks, and she trembled visibly. She ran to the other side of the boat, where Mrs. Swancourt was standing. 'Let us go home by railway with papa, after all,' she pleaded earnestly. 'I would rather go with him. Shall we?' Mrs. Swancourt looked round for a moment, as if unable to decide. 'Ah!' she exclaimed, 'it is too late now. Why did you not say so before, when we had plenty of time?' The Juliet had that minute let go, the engines had started, and they were gliding slowly away from the quay. There was no help for it but to remain, unless the Juliet could be made to put back, and that would create a great disturbance. Elfride gave up the idea and submitted quietly. Her happiness was sadly mutilated now. The woman whose presence had so disturbed her was exactly like Mrs. Jethway. She seemed to haunt Elfride like a shadow. After several minutes' vain endeavour to account for any design Mrs. Jethway could have in watching her, Elfride decided to think that if it were the widow, the encounter was accidental. She remembered that the widow in her restlessness was often visiting the village near Southampton, which was her original home, and it was possible that she chose water transit with the idea of saving expense.
what is the matter, Elfride?' Knight inquired, standing before her.
'Nothing more than that I am rather depressed.'
'I don't much wonder at it. That wharf was depressing. We seemed underneath and inferior to everything around us. But we shall be in the sea breeze again soon, and that will freshen you, dear.'
The evening closed in, and dusk increased as they made their way down Southampton Water and through the Solent. Elfride's disturbance of mind was such that her light spirit of the foregoing 24 hours had entirely deserted her. The weather, too, had grown more gloomy, for though the showers of the morning had ceased, the sky was covered more closely than ever with dense leaden cloud. How beautiful was the sunset when they had rounded the North Foreland the previous evening! Now it was impossible to tell within half an hour the time of the luminaries going down. Knight led her about, and being by this time accustomed to her sudden changes of mood, overlooked the necessity of a cause in regarding the conditions impressionableness and elasticity. Elfride looked stealthily to the other end of the vessel. Mrs. Jethway, or her double, was sitting at the stern, her eyes steadily regarding Elfride. 'Let us go to the fore part,' she said quickly to Knight. 'See, there the man is fixing the lights for the night.' Knight assented, and after watching the operation of fixing the red and the green lights on the port and starboard bows, and the hoisting of the white light to the masthead, he walked up and down with her till the increase of wind rendered promenading difficult. Elfride's eyes were occasionally to be found furtively gazing abaft to learn if her enemy were really there. Nobody was visible now.
'Shall we go below?'
said Knight, seeing that the deck was nearly deserted. 'No,' she said. 'If you will kindly get me a rug from Mrs. Swancourt, I should like, if you don't mind, to stay here.' She had recently fancied the assumed Mrs. Jethway might be a first class passenger, and dreaded meeting her by accident. Knight appeared with the rug, and they sat down behind a weather cloth on the windward side, just as the two red eyes of the Needles glared upon them from the gloom, their pointed summits rising like shadowy phantom figures against the sky. It became necessary to go below to an 8 o'clock meal of nondescript kind, and Elfride was immensely relieved at finding no sign of Mrs. Jethway there. They again ascended, and remained above till Mrs. Snewson staggered up to them with the message that Mrs. Swancourt thought it was time for Elfride to come below. Knight accompanied her down, and returned again to pass a little more time on deck. Elfride partly undressed herself and lay down, and soon became unconscious, though her sleep was light. How long she had lain she knew not, when by slow degrees she became cognizant of a whispering in her ear. 'You are well on with him, I can see. Well, provoke me now. My day will come, you will find.' That seemed to be the utterance, or words to that effect. Elfride became broad awake and terrified. She knew the words, if real, could only be those of one person, and that person the widow Jetway. The lamp had gone out and the place was in darkness. In the next berth she could hear her stepmother breathing heavily. Further on, Snewson breathing more heavily still. These were the only other legitimate occupants of the cabin, and Mrs. Jethway must have stealthily come in by some means and retreated again, or else she had entered an empty berth next Snewson's. The fear that this was the case increased Elfride's perturbation, till it assumed the dimensions of a certainty. For how could a stranger from the other end of the ship possibly contrive to get in? Could it have been a dream? Elfride raised herself higher and looked out of the window. There was the sea, floundering and rushing against the ship's side just by her head, and thence stretching away dim and moaning into an expanse of indistinctness, and far beyond all this two placid lights like rayless stars. Now, almost fearing to turn her face inward again, lest Mrs. Jethway should appear at her elbow, Elfride meditated upon whether to call Snewson to keep her company. 4 bells sounded, and she heard voices, which gave her a little courage. It was not worth while to call Snewson. At any rate, Elfride could not stay there panting longer, at the risk of being again disturbed by that dreadful whispering. So, wrapping herself up hurriedly, she emerged into the passage, and by the aid of a faint light burning at the entrance to the saloon, found the foot of the stairs and ascended to the deck. Dreary the place was in the extreme. It seemed a new spot altogether in contrast with its daytime self. She could see the glow-worm light from the binnacle, and the dim outline of the man at the wheel, also a form at the bows. Not another soul was apparent from stem to stern. Yes, there were 2 more, by the bulwarks. One proved to be her Harry, and the other the mate. She was glad indeed, and on drawing closer found they were holding a low slow chat about nautical affairs. She ran up and slipped her hand through Knight's arm, partly for love and partly for stability. 'Elfie, not asleep?' said Knight, after moving a few steps aside with her. 'No, I cannot sleep. May I stay here? It is so dismal down there, and I was afraid. Where are we now?' 'Due south of Portland Bill. Those are the lights abeam of us. Look, a terrible spot that on a stormy night. Do you see a very small light that dips and rises to the right? That's a lightship on the dangerous shoal called the Shambles, where many a good vessel has gone to pieces. Between it and ourselves is a race, a place where antagonistic currents meet and form whirlpools, a spot which is rough in the smoothest weather and terrific in a wind. That dark dreary horizon we just discern to the left is the West Bay, terminated landward by Chesil Beach.' 'What time is it, Harry?' 'Just past 2.' 'Are you going below?'
Oh, no, not to night. I prefer pure air.
She fancied he might be displeased with her for coming to him at this unearthly hour. 'I should like to stay here too, if you will allow me,' she said timidly. 'I want to ask you things.'
'Allow you, Elfie?' said Knight, putting his arm around her and drawing her closer. 'I am twice as happy with you by my side. Yes, we will stay and watch the approach of day.' So they again sought out the sheltered nook, and sitting down wrapped themselves in the rug as before. 'What were you going to ask me?' he inquired, as they undulated up and down.
'Oh, it was not much. Perhaps a thing I ought not ask,' she said hesitatingly. Her sudden wish had been to discover at once whether he had ever been engaged to be married. If he had, she would make that a ground for telling him a little of her conduct with Stephen. Mrs. Jethway's seeming words had so depressed the girl that she herself now painted her flight in the darkest colours, and longed to ease her burdened mind by an instant confession. If Knight had ever been imprudent himself, he might, she hoped, forgive all. 'I wanted to ask you,' she went on, 'if you had ever been engaged before?' She added tremulously, I hope you have. I mean, I don't mind at all if you have.'
'No, I never was,' said Knight instantly, and heartily replied, 'Elfride.' And there was a certain happy pride in his tone. 'I am 12 years older than you, and I have been about the world, and in a way into society, and you have not. And yet I am not so unfit for you as strict thinking people might imagine, who would assume the difference of age to signify most surely an equal addition to my practice in love making.'
Elfride shivered.
'You are cold. The wind is too much for you.
'No,' she said gloomily. The belief which had been her sheet anchor in hoping for forgiveness had proved false. This account of the exceptional nature of his experience, a matter which would have set her rejoicing 2 years ago, chilled her now like a frost. 'You don't mind my asking you?' she continued.
'Oh no, not at all.
'And have you never kissed many ladies?' she whispered, hoping he would say 100 at least. The time, the circumstances, and the scene were such as to draw confidences from the most reserved.
'Elfride,'
whispered Knight in reply, 'it is strange you should have asked that question, but I'll answer it, though I have never told such a thing before. I have been rather absurd in my avoidance of women. I have never given a woman a kiss in my life, except yourself and my mother.' The man of 32, with the experienced mind, warmed all over with a boy's ingenuous shame as he made the confession. 'What, not one?' she faltered.
'No, not one.'
'How very strange!'
'Yes, the reverse experience may be commoner, and yet to those who have observed their own sex, as I have, my case is not remarkable. Men about town are women's favourites, that is postulate, and superficial people don't think far enough to see that there may be reserved, lonely exceptions.' 'Are you proud of it, Harry?' 'No, indeed. Of late years I have wished I had gone my ways and trod out my measure like lighter hearted men. I have thought of how many happy experiences I may have lost through never going to woo.'
'And why did you hold aloof?'
'I cannot say. I don't think it was my nature to. Circumstances hindered me, perhaps. I have regretted it for another reason. This great remissness of mine has had its effect upon me. The older I have grown, the more distinctly I have perceived that it is absolutely preventing me from liking any woman who is not as unpractised as I, and I gave up the expectation of finding a 19th century young lady in my own raw state. Then I found you, Elfride, and I felt for the first time that my fastidiousness was a blessing, and it helped to make me worthy of you. I felt at once that, differing as we did in our experiences, in this matter I resembled you.' 'Well, aren't you glad to hear it, Elfride?'
'Yes, I am,' she answered in a forced voice. 'But I always had thought that men made lots of engagement before they married, especially if they don't marry very young.'
'So all women think, I suppose, and rightly indeed, of the majority of bachelors, as I said before. But an appreciable minority of slow coach men do not, and it makes them very awkward when they do come to the point. However, it didn't matter in my case.'
'Why?' she asked uneasily.
'Because you know even less of love making and matrimonial prearrangement than I, and so you can't draw invidious comparisons if I do my engaging improperly.'
'I think you do it beautifully.'
'Thank you, dear. But,' continued Knight laughingly, 'your opinion is not that of an expert, which alone is of value.'
Had she answered, 'Yes, it is,' half as strongly as she felt it, Knight might have been a little astonished.
'If you had ever been engaged to be married before,' he went on, 'I expect your opinion of my addresses would be different. But then I should not.'
'Should not what, Harry?'
'Oh, I was merely going to say that in that case I should never have given myself the pleasure of proposing to you, since your freedom from that experience was your attraction, my darling.'
'You are severe upon women, are you not?'
'No, I think not. I had a right to please my tastes, and that was for untried lips. Other men than those of my sort acquire the taste as they get older, but don't find an Elfride.'
'What horrid sound is that we hear when we pitch forward?'
'Only the screw. Don't find an Elfride as I did.
To think that I should have discovered such an unseen flower down here in the West, to whom a man is as much as a multitude to some women, and a trip down the English Channel like a voyage round the world.' 'And would you,' she said, and her voice was tremulous, 'have given up a lady if you had become engaged to her, and then found that she had had one kiss before yours? And would you have gone away and left her?'
'One kiss? No, hardly for that.'
'Two?'
'Well, I can hardly say inventorially like that. Too much of that sort of thing certainly would make me dislike a woman. But let us confine our attention to ourselves, not go thinking of might have beens.'
So Elfride had allowed her thoughts to dally with false surmise, and every one of Knight's words fell upon her like a weight. After this they were silent for a long time, gazing upon the black mysterious sea, and hearing the strange voice of the restless wind. A rocking to and fro on the waves, when the breeze is not too violent and cold, produces a soothing effect even upon the most highly wrought mind. Elfride slowly sank against Knight, and looking down, he found by her soft regular breathing that she had fallen asleep. Not wishing to disturb her, he continued still, and took an intense pleasure in supporting her warm young form as it rose and fell with her every breath. Knight fell to dreaming too, though he continued wide awake. It was pleasant to realize the implicit trust she placed in him, and to think of the charming innocence of one who could sink into sleep in so simple and unceremonious a manner. More than all, the musing unpractical student felt the immense responsibility he was taking upon himself by becoming the protector and guide of such a trusting creature. The quiet slumber of her soul lent a quietness to his own. Then she moaned and turned herself restlessly. Presently her mutterings became distinct. 'Don't tell him. He will not love me. I did not mean any disgrace. Indeed I did not. So don't tell Harry. We were going to be married, that's why I ran away. And he says he will not have a kissed woman. And if you tell him, he will go away, and I shall die. I pray have mercy. Oh!' Elfride started up wildly. The previous moment a musical ding dong had spread into the air from their right hand and awakened her. 'What is that?' she exclaimed in terror.
'Only 8 bells,' said Knight soothingly. 'Don't be frightened, little bird, you are safe. What have you been dreaming about?'
'I can't tell,' she said with a shudder. 'Oh, I don't know what to do.'
'Stay quietly with me. We shall soon see the dawn now. Look, the morning star is lovely over there. The clouds have completely cleared off whilst you have been sleeping. What have you been dreaming of?'
'A woman in our parish.'
'Don't you like her?'
'I don't, and she doesn't like me. Where are we?'
'About south of the Exe.'
Knight said no more on the words of her dream. They watched the sky till Elfride grew calm, and the dawn appeared. It was mere wan lightness first. Then the wind blew in a changed spirit and died away to a zephyr. The star dissolved into the day. 'That is how I should like to die,' said Elfride, rising from her seat and leaning over the bulwark to watch the star's last expiring gleam.
'As the lines say,' Knight replied, 'to set as sets the morning star, which goes not down behind the darkened west, nor hides obscured among the tempests of the sky, but melts away into the light of heaven.'
'Oh, other people have thought the same thing, haven't they? That's always the case with my originalities. They are original to nobody but myself.'
'Not only the case with yours. When I was a young hand at reviewing, I used to find that a frightful pitfall. Dilating on subjects I met with which were novelties to me, and finding afterwards they had been exhausted by the thinking world when I was in pinafores.'
'That is delightful. Whenever I find you have done a foolish thing I am glad, because it seems to bring you a little nearer to me, who have done many.' And Elfride thought again of her enemy asleep under the deck they trod. All up the coast prominences singled themselves out from recesses. Then a rosy sky spread over the eastern sea and behind the low line of land, flinging its livery and dashes upon the thin airy clouds in that direction. Every projection on the land seemed now so many fingers anxious to catch a little of the liquid light thrown so prodigally over the sky. And after a fantastic time of lustrous yellows in the east, the higher elevations, along the shore were flooded with the same hues. The bluff and bare contours of Start Point caught the brightest, earliest glow of all, and so also did the sides of its white lighthouse, perched upon a shelf in its precipitous front like a mediaeval saint in a niche. Their lofty neighbour, Bolt Head, on the left, remained as yet ungilded, and retained its grey. Then up came the sun, as it were, in jerks, just to seaward of the easternmost point of land, flinging out a Jacob's ladder path of light from itself to Elfride and Knight, and coating them with rays in a few minutes. The inferior dignitaries of the shore, Forward Point, Berry Head, and Prawl, had all acquired their share of the illumination ere this, and at length the very smallest protuberance of wave, cliff, or inlet, even to the innermost recesses of the lovely valley of the Dart, had its portion, and sunlight, now the common possession of all, ceased to be the wonderful and coveted thing it had been a short half hour before. After breakfast Plymouth arose into view, and grew distincter to their nearing vision, the breakwater appearing like a streak of phosphoric light upon the surface of the sea. Elfride looked furtively around for Mrs. Jethway, but could discern no shape like hers. Afterwards, in the bustle of landing, she looked again with the same result, by which time the woman had probably glided upon the quay unobserved. Expanding with a sense of relief, Elfride waited whilst Knight looked to their luggage, and then saw her father approaching through the crowd, twirling his walking stick to catch their attention. Elbowing the way to him, they all entered the town, which smiled as sunny a smile upon Elfride as it had done between 1 and 2 years earlier, when she had entered it at precisely the same hour as the bride elect of Stephen Smith. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 30. Vassal unto Love. Elfride clung closer to Knight as day succeeded day. Whatever else might admit of question, there could be no dispute that the allegiance she bore him absorbed her whole soul and existence. A greater than Stephen had arisen, and she had left all to follow him. The unreserved girl was never chary of letting her lover discover how much she admired him. She never once held an idea in opposition to any one of his, or insisted on any point with him, or showed any independence, or held her own on any subject. His lightest whim she respected and obeyed as law, and if, expressing her opinion on a matter, he took up the subject and differed from her, she instantly threw down her own opinion as wrong and untenable. Even her ambiguities and espiègleries were but media of the same manifestation, acted charades, embodying the words of her prototype, the tender and susceptible daughter-in-law of Naomi. 'Let me find favour in thy sight, my lord, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thine handmaid.' She was syringing the plants one wet day in the greenhouse. Knight was sitting under a great passion flower observing the scene. Sometimes he looked out at the rain from the sky, and then at Elfride's inner rain of larger drops, which fell from trees and shrubs after having previously hung from the twigs like small silver fruit. 'I must give you something to make you think of me during this autumn at your chambers,' she was saying. 'What shall it be? Portraits do more harm than good, by selecting the worst expression of which your face is capable. Hair is unlucky, and you don't like jewellery. Something which shall bring back my mind to the many scenes we have enacted in this conservatory. I see what I should prize very much, that dwarf myrtle tree in the pot, which you have been so carefully tending.' Elfride looked thoughtfully at the myrtle. 'I can carry it comfortably in my hat box,' said Knight, 'and I will put it in my window, and so, it always being before my eyes, I shall think of you continually.' It so happened that the myrtle which Knight had singled out had a peculiar beginning and history.
It had originally been a twig worn in Stephen Smith's buttonhole, and he had taken it thence, stuck it into the pot, and told her that if it grew she was to take care of it and keep it in remembrance of him when he was far away. She looked wistfully at the plant, and the sense of fairness to Smith's memory caused her a pang of regret that Knight should have asked for that very one. It seemed exceeding a common heartlessness to let it go. 'Is there not anything you like better?' she said sadly. 'It is only an ordinary myrtle.'
'No, I am fond of myrtle.'
Seeing that she did not take kindly to the idea, he said again, 'Why do you object to me having that?' 'Oh no, I don't object precisely. It was a feeling. Ah, here's another cutting lately struck, and just as small, of a better kind, and with prettier leaves. Myrtus microphylla.'
'That will do nicely. Let it be put in my room that I may not forget it. What romance attaches to the other?'
'It was a gift to me.' The subject then dropped. Knight thought no more of the matter till, on entering his bedroom in the evening, he found the second myrtle placed upon his dressing table as he had directed. He stood for a moment admiring the fresh appearance of the leaves by candlelight, and then he thought of the transaction of the day. Male lovers as well as female can be spoilt by too much kindness, and Elfride's uniform submissiveness had given Knight a rather exacting manner at crises, attached to her as he was. 'Why should she have refused the first one I chose?' he now asked himself. Even such a slight opposition as she had shown then was exceptional enough to make itself noticeable. He was not vexed with her in the least. The mere variation of her way to day from her usual ways kept him musing on the subject, because it perplexed him. It was a gift. Those were her words. Admitting it to be a gift, he thought she could hardly value a mere friend more than she valued him as a lover, and giving the plant to his charge would have made no difference. 'Except, indeed, it was the gift of a lover,' he murmured. 'I wonder if Elfride has ever had a lover before?' he said aloud, as a new idea quite. This and companion thoughts were enough to occupy him completely till he fell asleep rather later than usual. The next day, when they were again alone, he said to her rather suddenly, 'Do you love me more or less, Elfride, for what I told you on board the steamer?' 'You told me so many things,' she returned, lifting her eyes to his and smiling. 'I mean the confession you coaxed out of me that I had never been in the position of lover before.' 'It is a satisfaction, I suppose, to be the first in your heart,' she said to him, with an attempt to continue her smiling. 'I am going to ask you a question now,' said Knight somewhat awkwardly. 'I only ask it in a whimsical way, you know, not with great seriousness, Elfride. You may think it odd, perhaps.' Elfride tried desperately to keep the colour in her face. She could not, though distressed to think that getting pale showed consciousness of deeper guilt than merely getting red. 'Oh no, I shall not think that,' she said, because obliged to say something to fill the pause which followed her questioner's remark. 'It is this. Have you ever had a lover? I am almost sure you have not, but have you?' 'Not, as it were, a lover. I mean, not worth mentioning, Harry,' she faltered. Knight, overstrained in sentiment as he knew the feeling to be, felt some sickness of heart. 'Still, he was a lover.' 'Well, a sort of lover, I suppose,' she responded tardily. 'A man, I mean, you know.' 'Yes, but a mere person, and—' 'But truly your lover?' 'Yes, a lover, certainly. He was that. Yes, he might have been called my lover.' Knight said nothing to this for a minute or more, and kept silent time with his finger to the tick of the old library clock, in which room the colloquy was going on. 'You don't mind, Harry, do you?' she said anxiously, nestling close to him and watching his face. 'Of course I don't seriously mind. In reason, a man cannot object to such a trifle. I only thought you hadn't, that was all.' However, one ray was abstracted from the glory about her head. But afterwards, when Knight was wandering by himself over the bare and breezy hills, and meditating on the subject, that ray suddenly returned. For she might have had a lover, and never have cared in the least for him. She might have used the word improperly, and meant admirer all the time. Of course she had been admired, and one man might have made his admiration more prominent than that of the rest, a very natural case. They were sitting on one of the garden seats when he found occasion to put the supposition to the test. 'Did you love that lover or admirer of yours ever so little, Elfie?' She murmured reluctantly, 'Yes, I think I did.' Knight felt the same faint touch of misery. 'Only a very little?' he said. 'I am not sure how much.' 'But you are sure, darling, you loved him a little?' 'I think I am sure I loved him a little.' 'And not a great deal, Elfie?' 'My love was not supported by reverence for his powers.' 'But, Elfride, did you love him deeply?' said Knight restlessly. 'I don't exactly know how deep you mean by deeply.' 'That's nonsense.' 'You misapprehend, and you have let go of my hand!' she cried, her eyes filling with tears. 'Harry, don't be severe with me, and don't question me. I did not love him as I do you, and could it be deeply if I did not think him cleverer than myself? For I did not. You grieve me so much you can't think.' 'I will not say another word about it.' 'And you will not think about it either, will you? I know you think of weaknesses in me after I am out of your sight, and not knowing what they are, I cannot combat them. I almost wish you were of grosser nature, Harry, I do in truth. Or rather, I wish I could have the advantages such a nature in you would afford me, and yet have you as you are.' 'What advantages would they be?' 'Less anxiety and more security. Ordinary men are not so delicate in their tastes as you; and where the lover or husband is not fastidious and refined and of deep nature, things seem to go on better, I fancy, as far as I have been able to observe in the world.' 'Yes, I suppose it is right. Shallowness has this advantage, that you can't be drowned there.' 'But I think I'll have you as you are. Yes, I will,' she said winsomely. 'The practical husbands and wives who take things philosophically are very humdrum, are they not? Yes, it would kill me quite. You please me best as you are.' 'Even though I wish you had never cared for one before me?' 'Yes, and you must not wish it. Don't.' 'I'll try not to, Elfride.' So she hoped, but her heart was troubled. If he felt so deeply on this point, what would he say did he know all, and see it as Mrs. Jethway saw it? He would never make her the happiest girl in the world by taking her to be his own for aye. The thought enclosed her as a tomb whenever it presented itself to her perturbed brain. She tried to believe that Mrs. Jethway would never do her such a cruel wrong as to increase the bad appearance of her folly by innuendos, and concluded that concealment having been begun must be persisted in if possible. For what he might consider as bad as the fact was her previous concealment of it by strategy. But Elfride knew Mrs. Jethway to be her enemy and to hate her. It was possible she would do her worst, and should she do it, all might be over. Would the woman listen to reason, and be persuaded not to ruin one who had never intentionally harmed her? It was night in the valley between Endelstow Crags and the shore. The brook which trickled that way to the sea was distinct in its murmurs now, and over the line of its course there began to hang a white riband of fog. Against the sky, on the left hand of the vale, the black form of the church could be seen. On the other rose hazel bushes, a few trees, and where these were absent, furze tufts as tall as men, on stems nearly as stout as timber. The shriek of some bird was occasionally heard as it flew terror stricken from its first roost to seek a new sleeping place where it might pass the night unmolested. In the evening shade, some way down the valley, and under a row of scrubby oaks, a cottage could still be discerned. It stood absolutely alone. The house was rather large, and the windows of some of the rooms were nailed up with boards on the outside, which gave a particularly deserted appearance to the whole erection. From the front door an irregular series of rough and misshapen steps, cut in the solid rock, led down to the edge of the streamlet, which at their extremity was hollowed into a basin through which the water trickled. This was evidently the means of water supply to the dweller or dwellers in this cottage. A light footstep was heard descending from the higher slopes of the hillside. Indistinct in the pathway appeared a moving female shape, who advanced and knocked timidly at the door. No answer being returned, the knock was repeated, with the same result, and it was then repeated a third time. This was also unsuccessful. From one of the only two windows on the ground floor which were not boarded up came rays of light, no shutter or curtain obscuring the room from the eyes of a passer by on the outside. So few walked that way after nightfall that any such means to secure secrecy were probably deemed unnecessary. The inequality of the rays falling upon the trees outside told that the light had its origin from a flickering fire only. The visitor, after the third knocking, stepped a little to the left in order to gain a view of the interior, and threw back the hood from her face. The dancing yellow sheen revealed the fair and anxious countenance of Elfride. Inside the house this firelight was enough to illuminate the room distinctly, and to show that the furniture of the cottage was superior to what might have been expected from so unpromising an exterior. It also showed to Elfride that the room was empty. Beyond the light quiver and flap of the flames, nothing moved or was audible therein. She turned the handle and entered, throwing off the cloak which enveloped her, under which she appeared without hat or bonnet, and in the sort of half toilette country people ordinarily dine in. Then, advancing to the foot of the staircase, she called distinctly, but somewhat fearfully, 'Mrs. Jethway?' No answer. With a look of relief and regret combined, denoting that ease came to the heart and disappointment to the brain, Elfride paused for several minutes, as if undecided how to act. Determining to wait, she sat down on a chair. The minutes drew on, and after sitting on the thorns of impatience for half an hour, she searched her pocket, took therefrom a letter, and tore off the blank leaf. Then, taking out a pencil, she wrote upon the paper: 'Dear Mrs. Jethway, I have been to visit you. I wanted much to see you, but I cannot wait any longer. I came to beg you not to execute the threats you have repeated to me. Do not, I beseech you, Mrs. Jethway, let any one know I ran away from home. It would ruin me with him, and break my heart. I will do anything for you if you will be kind to me. In the name of our common womanhood, do not, I implore you, make a scandal of me. Yours, E. Swancourt.' She folded the note cornerwise, directed it, and placed it on the table. Then, again drawing the hood over her curly head, she emerged silently as she had come. Whilst this episode had been in action at Mrs. Jethway's cottage, Knight had gone from the dining room to the drawing room, and found Mrs. Swancourt alone there. 'Elfride has vanished upstairs or somewhere,' she said, 'and I have been reading an article in an old number of The Present that I lighted upon by chance a short time ago. It is an article you once told us was yours. Well, Harry, with due deference to your literary powers, allow me to say that this effusion is all nonsense, in my opinion.' 'What is it about?' said Knight, taking up the paper and reading. 'There, don't get all red about it. Own that experience has taught you to be more charitable. I have never read such unchivalrous statements in my life. From a man, I mean. There, I forgive you. It was before you knew Elfride.' 'Oh yes,' said Knight, looking up. 'I remember now. The text of that sermon was not my own at all, but was suggested to me by a young man named Smith, the same whom I have mentioned to you as coming from this parish. I thought the idea rather ingenious at the time, and enlarged it to the weight of a few guineas, because I had nothing else in my head.' 'Which idea do you call the text? I am curious to know that.' 'Well, this,' said Knight, somewhat unwillingly, 'that experience teaches, and your sweetheart, no less than your tailor, is necessarily very imperfect in her duties, if you are her first patron; and conversely, the sweetheart who is graceful under the initial kiss must be supposed to have had some practice in the trade.' 'And do you mean to say that you wrote that upon the strength of another man's remark, without having tested it by practice?' 'Yes, indeed I do.' 'Then I think it was uncalled for and unfair. And how do you know it is true? I expect you regret it now.' 'Since you bring me into a serious mood, I will speak candidly. I do believe that remark to be perfectly true, and having written it, I will defend it anywhere. But I do often regret having ever written it, as well as others of the sort. I have grown older since, and I find such a tone of writing is calculated to do harm in the world. Every literary Jack becomes a gentleman if he can only pen a few indifferent satires upon womankind. Women themselves, too, have taken to the trick, and so upon the whole I begin to be rather ashamed of my companions.' 'Ah, Henry, you have fallen in love since, and it makes a difference,' said Mrs. Swancourt, with a faint tone of banter. 'That's true, but that is not my reason.' 'Having found that, in a case of your own experience, a so called goose was a swan, it seems absurd to deny such a possibility in other men's experiences.' 'You can hit palpably, cousin Charlotte,' said Knight. 'You are like the boy who puts a stone inside his snowball, and I shall play with you no longer. Excuse me, I am going for my evening stroll.' Though Knight had spoken jestingly, this incident and conversation had caused him a sudden depression. Coming rather singularly just after his discovery that Elfride had known what it was to love warmly before she had known him, his mind dwelt upon the subject, and the familiar pipe he smoked whilst pacing up and down the shrubbery path failed to be a solace. He thought again of those idle words, hitherto quite forgotten, about the first kiss of a girl, and the theory seemed more than reasonable. Of course their sting now lay in their bearing on Elfride. Elfride, under Knight's kiss, had certainly been a very different woman from herself under Stephen's. Whether for good or ill, she had marvellously well learnt a betrothed lady's part, and the fascinating finish of her deportment in this second campaign did probably arise from her unreserved encouragement of Stephen. Knight, with all the rapidity of jealous sensitiveness, pounced upon some words she had inadvertently let fall about an earring, which he had only partially understood at the time. It was during that initial kiss by the waterfall. 'We must be careful. I lost the other by doing this.' A flush, which had in it as much of wounded pride as of sorrow, passed over Knight as he thought of what he had so frequently said to her in his simplicity. 'I always meant to be the first comer in a woman's heart, fresh lips or none for me.' How childishly blind he must have seemed to this mere girl! How she must have laughed at him inwardly! He absolutely writhed as he thought of the confession she had wrung from him on the boat in the darkness of night. The one conception which had sustained his dignity when drawn out of his shell on that occasion, that of her charming ignorance of all such matters, how absurd it was! This man, whose imagination had been fed up to preternatural size by the lonely study and silent observations of his kind, whose emotions had been drawn out long and delicate by his seclusion, like plants in a cellar, was now absolutely in pain. Moreover, several years of poetic study, and, if the truth must be told, poetic efforts, had tended to develop the affective side of his constitution still further, in proportion to his active faculties. It was his belief in the absolute newness of blandishment to Elfride which had constituted her primary charm. He began to think it was as hard to be the earliest in a woman's heart as it was to be the first in the pool of Bethesda. That Knight should have been thus constituted, that Elfride's second lover should not have been one of the great mass of bustling mankind, little given to introspection, whose good nature might have compensated for any lack of appreciativeness, was the chance of things. That her throbbing, self confounding, indiscreet heart should have to defend itself unaided against the keen scrutiny and logical power which Knight, now that his suspicions were awakened, would sooner or later be sure to exercise against her, was her misfortune. A miserable incongruity was apparent in the circumstance of a strong mind practising its unerring archery upon a heart which the owner of that mind loved better than his own. Elfride's docile devotion to Knight was now its own enemy. Clinging to him so dependently, she taught him in time to presume upon that devotion, a lesson men are not slow to learn. A slight rebelliousness occasionally would have done him no harm, and would have been a world of advantage to her. But she idolized him, and was proud to be his bond servant. End of chapter 30.